once a week, vegans eat beef, which to me was a shock because I never cheated on beef, but I certainly binged on eggs and dairy every chance I got.
It seems the only myth here is that, Lierre, you claim you were a vegan for 20 years, but you were binging on dairy and eggs every opportunity you would get. Because people already want to believe this stuff, it's so easy to buy into. It's like, yes, I've been looking for a reason why it's okay for me to do this thing, even though I know it's wrong to have slaves. The fact that I know that by having slaves, I'm supporting the economy, and that I'm giving slaves a better opportunity, it's justifiable. If you can be made to believe absurdities, you will be made to commit atrocities.
Agriculture is the most destructive thing that people have done to the planet. And I can walk you through that if you want to hear about it. So I thought that I was eating this peaceful, loving, sustainable, totally compassionate diet. And it's not true. It is the most destructive human activity. And those were the foods I was eating, as somehow thinking that this was peaceful and compassionate. It's not. It's biotic cleansing is what it is.
Agriculture is devastatingly destructive to the environment. It destroys the topsoils. It destroys billions of microbial life, which is no small thing. However, what you fail to mention is that you're already a part of that. You obviously eat plants, and I know what you're saying, that you're shifting your focus towards animals. By eating them, you're not having as much of a detrimental impact as a vegetarian or a vegan, but you forgot to account the fact that by you eating animals, you're responsible for all of the agriculture that they are consuming. It requires a tremendous amount more agriculture to sustain these animals than it does not to sustain them. And considering that we are breeding 10 billion animals every year, in the United States alone, we slaughter over 65 billion land animals, and 2/3 of the grain goes towards feeding animals, 1/3 of the food goes towards feeding these animals. We're producing all of this agriculture, and it's going towards these animals. Therefore, you, by consuming animals, you're more to blame. And then you take into consideration the fact that with animal agriculture, it takes 18 times more land, 13 times more water, 11 times more fossil fuels. It's responsible for, United Nations estimations say, up to 51% of the CO2 emissions on this planet. Many diseases that we caught through animals, from smallpox, measles, tuberculosis, these have all been contracted by animals through animal agriculture. The superbugs that are developed because of the antibiotics that we are putting into these animals. The list goes on and on and on. And there are solutions to this problem. There's permaculture. There is organic farming. There are new techniques that we can utilize in which to make agriculture more sustainable. You talk about how you don't support factory farming. So assuming that you don't want to eat any of your meat that has been sourced through factory farming, and you're just going to be relying on, say, grass-fed beef, even in a situation when you're doing this, grass-fed beef is generally substituted with soy. And even if it's a situation where, let's say, for argument's sake, you were gaining all of your meat ethically, it's not sustainable. A tremendous amount of the land in the United States is already used towards cows. Now, if everyone on the planet decided to throw away factory farming, the reason that we started doing factory farming was because there was such a tremendous demand for meat. We produced billions of animals every single year so people can eat them. If we threw that away, we stopped producing these animals and started just relying on game meat, within a very short amount of time, there would not be enough animals on the planet. People want to call themselves an environmentalist because they like the title. You cannot call yourself an environmentalist in the 21st century if you were eating meat, period.
It was actually a complete disaster for human health when people switch from these nutrient-dense diets based on animals to diets based strictly on carbohydrate. And the archaeological record could not be clearer. Their bones just crumble, their teeth fall out, and they shrink 6 inches almost immediately.
Geez.
Right
so
there.
basically, if we go vegan, fast forward a couple hundred years, we're Lord of the Flies smacking chubby little piggy for his glasses to create a fire.
Yes, we are.
This is beautiful. I love that you can say something with such gusto and such confidence that people are going to believe you. Oh, it's irrefutable, the fact that all societies that have tried to live off a agriculture-only system, they're all going to die and their teeth fall out. So much for people that lived off a complete plant-based diet. So much for these ancient civilizations such as ancient India, such as ancient Greece, with the founders like Plato and Pythagoras living off a plant-based diet. So much for so many vegetarians within the Egyptian societies. So much for certain American Indian tribes like the Choctaws. So much for the Aztecs, the Mayans, who, by the way, up to at least around the age of 10, would only live off a plant-based diet. So much for the gladiators that were amongst the best warriors in the world, and they thrived. They needed to be in perfect condition. So much for so many of these societies, not only in ancient times, but in recent times, like the Japanese living purely, for the most part, off a carbohydrate, starch-based diet. So much for the cells within our body running off glucose, which, by the way, is what carbohydrates are converted into.
Could one argue that if you're going to sort of create this moral equivalency between animals and humans, which I don't believe in, could you then, isn't it pretty easy to then create the moral equivalency between, if we're all the same, or why would plants deserve any less consideration than the animals above them or humans?
Well, this was a problem I had when I was a vegan because I didn't want to make those hierarchies, and yet I was. So meat eaters would sort of taunt me with that question about, well, what about the plants? And I never had a good answer because I didn't want to be the person that said, well, animals count, but plants are just dead matter. They're just insensate salads, and I'm allowed to just help myself. Because I didn't want to put forward those kinds of hierarchies. I mean, this really goes back to ancient Greece, and their belief was that there's no sentience at all in stone, and then there's dirt on top of that, and that's not really alive either. And then you've got plants, and they're sort of alive, but not really. And then you've got animals, and they're more like us, so they sort of count. But then finally at the top, you've got humans. That's not how nature works. In fact, it's a cycle.
Hey guys, this is the same thing.
I'm pretty sure you understand the distinction between plants and animals, but you're using this as a justification just to make it more acceptable. Because clearly someone of your intelligence, even though I can see there's a lot of confusion in what you're saying, there's a distinction between animals and plants. Most 4-year-old kids do. Scientifically, plants are not sentient beings. They do not have a central nervous system. They do not have a brain. They do not have pain receptors. They do not have the ability to respond to pain in the same way that an animal does. They don't feel that pain in a visceral, tangible, palpable way. It would be akin to me pulling out a strand of my hair. If you can see this over here, I'm not sure if you can, and saying that, well, this thing is alive, and granted, it has many particles within it, microscopic particles that are alive, and this thing is, just like my nail, would probably grow under certain conditions. To say that this thing is alive is similar to saying that a plant is alive. However, this thing over here is not an individuated consciousness. It is not this being that has full awareness of what is going on around it. And for you to compare a plant to an animal is tantamount to complete and utter insanity. And people like ancient philosophers, the founder of ancient Greece, at least one of them, Pythagoras or Plato, better example. Platonism is all about life within everything. It's all about us being governed by sentient beings anyway, by the anima, or the animus, which is basically the spirit, the soul within us. It's not to say that other things are not living. Everything is living in the Platonic universe. However, there is a distinction between sentient beings, these animals, and plants.
A lot more doctors are coming around. This is pretty much every day in the news you can find, okay, another study that shows, gosh, saturated fat actually doesn't hurt people.
Right.
We were wrong. It was even on the cover of Time, where they're like, oops, butter isn't bad.
You need saturated fats from animals like you need saturated fats from giraffe testicles. All the top sites, all the top authoritative sites like the USDA, they talk about how saturated fats and refined sugars, they tend to lead to something called cholesterol, the bad cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, which, by the way, is related to things such as atherosclerosis, heart disease, one of the biggest killers in the Western world.
Where did these consensus guidelines to dramatically lower saturated fat consumption come from? From literally hundreds of metabolic ward experiments, which means you don't just ask people to change their diets, you essentially lock them in a room for weeks if necessary and have total control over their diet. You can then experimentally change their level of saturated fat intake however you want and see the corresponding change in their cholesterol levels. And the results are so consistent, you can create an equation, the famous Hegstad equation, where you can predict how much their cholesterol will go up based on how much saturated fat you have them eat. So if you want your LDL cholesterol to go up 50 points, all you have to do is eat like 30% of your calories saturated fat. When you plug in the numbers, the change in cholesterol shoots up right as predicted. The experiments match the predictions. In fact, you can do it at home with one of those home cholesterol testing kits. Eat a stick of butter every day, watch your cholesterol climb. Not rocket science. And look at this. This was 1965. We've known about this for 50 years. They even keep calorie intake the same. Increases in saturated fat intake are associated with highly significant increases in LDL bad cholesterol. So if you feed vegetarians meat, even just once a day, their cholesterol jumps nearly 20% within a month. To prevent heart disease, ideally we need to get a total cholesterol under 150, which you can see these vegetarians were, but then even just once a day with the meat, and their cholesterol shot up 19%. But the good news is that within just 2 weeks of returning to their meat-free diet, their cholesterol dropped back down into the safe range. And indeed, randomized clinical trials show that dietary saturated fat reduction doesn't just appear to reduce cholesterol levels, but subsequent cardiovascular events like heart attacks as well. So no wonder there's a scientific consensus to decrease saturated fat intake.
And to say that saturated fats is necessary for brain power, I mean, if we had a look at all the most intelligent people of the last 1,000 years, not by my standards, but by your standards, so when I say you, I mean collectively, as a world, you'll find that the majority of these people abstain from animal-saturated fats. What does that tell you? So I'm talking about people like Plato, Pythagoras, Leonardo da Vinci, people like Nikola Tesla, people like Einstein towards his later years, people like Isaac Newton towards his later years, people like Sir Francis Bacon, Benjamin Franklin. Therefore, for you to say that all of these people did not have the adequate brain power is completely, utterly insane. Lierre, the most disturbing thing I find about your work is not that it is unassailably flawed in certain areas, but it is that rather than coming to terms with the fact that what you were doing is wrong, like most people, you try in your cognitive dissonance to find a way of justifying it to yourself so that you can go about living your life that you're actually good in what you're doing. And therefore you make the most ridiculous arguments. This is what I find a lot of people tend to do. I know that you don't support factory farming, but the fact that you make these arguments in that it is okay to go around killing these animals and it's somehow better for the ecosystem is completely asinine. Oh, and Lierre, this is veganism actually done properly, so be sure to like this video and share it.
Life's purpose is to feel joy. Metaphysical, lyrical, saying nothing truth. The only one to make change is walking in your shoes. Be the example, don't complain about the news. Making music and serving the world with the loo. Now you can be the same, or you can be the change. Find strength from inside, break through the chains. No one to blame, nothing to prove. You create your reality, it's up to you.